1966, in a quiet, unremarkable street in northern England, something woke up inside a family home. It didn't knock politely. It didn't whisper. It grabbed. It dragged a teenage girl up a flight of stairs by her throat, leaving bruises so severe that neighbors wept when they saw them. It ripped religious symbols from walls. It threw furniture like paper. It slashed family photographs with something invisible, something that left claw marks, and when the family finally saw it face to face, it was standing at the foot of the bed, a tall, dark figure, hooded, robed, watching them in silence. They called it the Black Monk of Pontefract, and to this day, no one has been able to explain it. Pontefract is a market town in West Yorkshire, England. It's the kind of place that carries history in its bones. A medieval fortress once stood here, and the town has witnessed royal executions, civil war, and centuries of quiet English life since. But in the mid-1960s, Pontefract was mostly known as an ordinary working-class town. Streets of terraced houses, families living close together, nothing unusual. Number 30 East Drive was one of those houses, a modest semi-detached home on a quiet residential street called the Checkerfields Estate. It was built in the late 1950s, clean, modern by the standards of the day, and utterly ordinary. In 1966, it was home to the Pritchard family, Joe and Jean Pritchard, their teenage daughter Diane, and their son Philip. Jean's parents, Vic and Sarah Shora, lived nearby and visited often. They were a normal family in a normal house on a normal street until the night the chalk dust fell from a clear ceiling, and nobody could explain why. It started small, the way these things often do. One evening in August 1966, Jean Pritchard was at home with her mother, Sarah. Joe was away for work. The children were out. The house was quiet. Then Sarah noticed something strange on the kitchen floor. A fine white powder, like chalk dust or flour, had appeared from nowhere. She looked up at the ceiling. Nothing. No crack, no hole, no explanation. She cleaned it up. It came back. Over the next hour, the powder reappeared multiple times, and then, as Jean and her mother stood there watching, the kitchen tap turned itself on, full blast. No one near it, no one touching it. They called a plumber the next day. He found nothing wrong with the pipes. He told them the tap simply couldn't turn itself on, but it had. They called the gas board, then the electricity board. Everyone who came found nothing. No leaks, no faults, no rational explanation. The house, by every measurable standard, was perfectly normal, but it wasn't done with them. A few nights later, the family woke to a sound that one visitor would later describe as someone dragging a heavy sack across the attic floor. Slow, deliberate, rhythmic. They checked the attic, empty. Then the banging started. If you've ever been alone in a house at night and heard an unexplained knock, a single knock from somewhere you can't locate, you know the feeling. Your heart seizes. You hold your breath. You wait. Now imagine that knock doesn't stop. For the Pritchard family, the banging became a nightly presence. It came from the walls, from beneath the floors, from behind the ceilings. It was loud enough to shake pictures on the walls, loud enough to be heard from outside the house. Neighbors reported hearing it. People walking past on East Drive would slow down and look at the house, unsure what they were hearing. The banging had a pattern, almost deliberate, almost intelligent. It would stop if you addressed it directly and start again the moment you turned away. It would mimic knocking rhythms. Sometimes it would answer back. Joe Pritchard, a practical man by all accounts, tried everything. He inspected every wall, every floorboard, every pipe. He found nothing, but that was only the beginning. Objects began to move. A plant on the kitchen windowsill traveled across the room on its own, sliding slowly, smoothly, as though pushed by invisible hands, and toppled off the far edge. A heavy pot was thrown from one side of the kitchen to the other. A wardrobe in the master bedroom inched itself away from the wall, and then, in one of the most widely reported moments of the entire haunting, the grandfather clock fell. It didn't lean, it didn't wobble. The grandfather clock, a heavy, full-standing antique, launched itself away from the wall and crashed violently across the hallway floor. Family members standing nearby had no time to react. It hit the ground with a force that shook the entire house. When they helped each other up from the shock of it, they noticed something that chilled them more than the fall itself. The clock's hands had stopped at the exact moment it hit the floor. The entity, because by now the family was certain there was something in that house, began to grow bolder. Family photographs on the walls were slashed, not removed, not knocked down, slashed, long, clean, diagonal cuts across the faces in the pictures, as though something with invisible claws had dragged itself slowly across the images. The glass in the frames was untouched. Only the photographs were marked. Religious items were a particular target. A crucifix on the bedroom wall was torn down repeatedly. Jean Pritchard was a woman of faith, and she kept replacing it, only to find it on the floor, ripped down again. A rosary that hung near the doorway was found twisted and knotted in ways that seemed to take deliberate effort. Holy water that a priest eventually brought to the house was thrown across the room before it could be used. Whatever was in that house did not welcome God. The attacks began to turn physical. The Pritchard daughter, Diane, a teenager at the time, bore the worst of it. She was pushed down the stairs on multiple occasions. Objects were thrown directly at her. She was pulled from her bed in the middle of the night, and in the most terrifying incident of the entire haunting, an incident that was witnessed, she was dragged. Diane was at the bottom of the staircase when it happened. The family watched in horror as she appeared to be lifted, her feet leaving the ground, and hauled backward up the stairs. Her hands gripped at the banister, at the walls, at anything she could reach. She was screaming, and yet she rose. When she stopped, when whatever had hold of her finally let go, she collapsed at the top of the landing. The bruising around her neck was so severe, it looked as though she had been choked by a pair of hands. Deep, dark marks, the kind left by fingers. The family doctor who examined her could not explain the injuries. He had no rational cause to offer, and Diane, shaking, barely able to speak, kept saying the same thing. Something grabbed me, something cold and dark. By this point, the Pritchard family was not suffering alone. Word had spread through the neighborhood. Friends, relatives, and curious locals began to visit East Drive, and many of them left shaken. Police were called on more than one occasion, and the officers who attended did not dismiss what they witnessed. In at least one documented visit, an officer watched as a plant pot moved on its own across a windowsill. He sat in silence for a long moment after it happened, and then asked a colleague to confirm what he'd seen. The colleague had. Neither man had a word for it. A neighbor, returning home one evening, watched through the window of number 30 as a kitchen chair slid itself from one wall to the other, slowly, smoothly, with no one near it. She backed away from the glass and didn't sleep that night. Word eventually reached paranormal investigators. In the late 1960s and into the 1970s, researchers began visiting the house, documenting the activity and interviewing the family. Among the visitors were members of what would later become the Society for Psychical Research. They installed recording equipment, conducted interviews, and sat overnight in the house. Most of them reported experiences they could not explain. Strange sounds, temperature drops so sudden they left vapor trails in breath, the unmistakable sense of being watched. The case attracted journalists too. British newspapers ran stories about the haunted house in Pontefract. The family was interviewed on radio, and as the coverage grew, so did the stream of visitors wanting to see for themselves. But no one, not the police, not the investigators, not the journalists, could explain what was happening at 30 East Drive, and none of them had yet seen the figure. There is a moment in every haunting, or at least in the telling of every great haunting, when the invisible becomes visible, when the thing that has been rattling walls and slamming doors finally shows itself. For the Pritchard family, that moment came without warning, the way the worst moments always do. Jean Pritchard was the first to see it clearly. She was standing in the hallway. It was evening, the house lit only partly, shadows pooling at the far end of the corridor, when she looked up and saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs, tall, dark, robed from head to foot in what appeared to be a long black cloak, the kind associated with monastic orders. The hood obscured its face entirely. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, watching her from the top of the landing with a stillness that was somehow more terrifying than anything that had moved before. Jean screamed. When the family rushed to her side, the figure was gone, but it came back.
Over the weeks and months that followed, multiple members of the family and several visitors to the house reported seeing the black monk, always in the same dark robes, always tall, taller than seemed natural, always still, always watching. Sometimes it appeared in doorways, sometimes in the corner of a room. On at least 2 occasions it was seen hovering above the floor, not standing but floating, the bottom of its robes hanging motionless where feet should have been. Diane reported waking in the night to find it standing at the foot of her bed, not moving, not speaking, just present in that particular way that felt like a violation, like something had entered a space where it had no right to be, and it knew exactly what it was doing. One investigator who stayed overnight in the house refused to sleep in the room he had been given. He said he had felt, with absolute certainty, that something was standing in the corner watching him from the moment the lights went out. He didn't see anything, but he was convinced something was there. And conviction, when it comes from trained investigators, from police officers, from people who came as skeptics, has a weight of its own. Who or what was the Black Monk of Pontefract? Researchers who investigated the case began to look into the history of the land beneath East Drive. What they found was unsettling. Pontefract, long before it was a modern market town, sat in the shadow of Pontefract Castle, a fortress of enormous historical significance. And near that castle, for centuries, there had stood a Cluniac monastery. The monks of that order were known for their black habits, long dark robes that covered them entirely. Records suggest that during the reign of Henry VIII, when the monasteries of England were dissolved by royal decree, the monks of Pontefract suffered greatly. Some accounts point to a monk who was executed, hanged, in the town during the upheaval of that period. The land on which the Checkerfields estate was eventually built, it sits, according to some researchers, directly above what was once the monastery's drainage system. Bones, human bones, are said to have been found in the area during construction. Whether the Black Monk was the ghost of a hanged cleric, a residual energy trapped in the earth beneath the estate, or something else entirely, is a question that remains open. But the theory has never fully been dismissed, and the behavior of the entity, its hostility toward religious symbols, its apparent targeting of the family, its appearance in monastic robes, fits a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Something old was in that house, something that remembered. The Pritchard family did not go quietly into their terror. They fought back in every way they knew how. Priests were brought to the house. The activity, on more than one occasion, seemed to intensify during religious rituals, as though the entity was responding to the challenge. Holy water was thrown across the room before it could be blessed in place. The crucifix continued to be torn down. One visiting clergyman, shaken by what occurred during his visit, reportedly refused to return. Paranormal investigators brought their own tools, recording devices, electromagnetic meters, temperature sensors. Some captured anomalous readings. Audio recordings from inside the house contained unexplained sounds, knocking with no source, voices at frequencies just below comprehension, breathing that belonged to no one in the room. The family tried simply leaving. For stretches of time, they stayed with relatives, hoping that absence would end it. It didn't. The activity sometimes continued even when the house was empty. Neighbors reported hearing the banging from outside, knowing full well no one was home. And when the family returned, the monk was still there. There were periods of relative quiet, weeks, even months, where the activity seemed to diminish. Researchers noted that the haunting appeared to follow cycles, growing more intense and then pulling back, as though it had its own rhythms, its own seasons. But quiet is not the same as gone. The Black Monk of Pontefract never fully left. It simply waited. The Pritchard family eventually moved away from 30 East Drive. What they experienced had marked them in ways that went beyond bruises and sleepless nights. Jean Pritchard, who lived to speak about the haunting in later interviews, maintained until her death that every single thing she had witnessed was real. She never wavered. She never retracted. The case was documented in a book, Holy Ghosts, the story of the world's most persistent poltergeist, and became, over time, one of the most thoroughly documented poltergeist cases in British history. The house at 30 East Drive is still standing. It has changed hands multiple times over the decades. Some owners reported nothing unusual. Others described experiences strikingly similar to what the Pritchards endured. The banging, the objects moving, the sudden cold, the sense of being watched. Today, 30 East Drive operates as a paranormal tourism attraction. You can book a night there. Dozens of groups, ghost hunters, paranormal enthusiasts, documentary filmmakers, and ordinary curious people have done exactly that. Many have left with nothing but a good story. Others have left early, in the dark, at speed. The Black Monk, by some accounts, has never stopped performing for an audience. In 1966, a family moved into a quiet house in a quiet town and encountered something that defied every explanation their world could offer. Decades later, the investigations continue, the theories multiply, the recordings pile up, and the house still stands at the end of East Drive, just as it always has. Ordinary looking, terraced, unremarkable from the street. But the people who've spent a night inside know the truth. Around 3 a.m., when the house is dark and still and every rational thought you have is fighting to stay in control, something knocks back. The Black Monk of Pontefract was never caught, never explained, never driven out. And according to those who have stood in that upstairs hallway in the dark, listening to the silence that isn't quite silence, it never left. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with a friend who loves creepy stories, and don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon, because this is just the beginning. The next story might be darker, and you won't want to miss it.